The phone rang at exactly 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I remember the time so clearly because I was sitting in my home office in Westchester County, going through quarterly reports from my investment portfolio, when Margaret's voice cut through the silence of my empty house. "Mr. Harrison, this is Margaret Chen from First National Private Banking. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time, but we have a rather urgent matter to discuss regarding your account." My fingers tightened around the receiver. In 35 years of banking with First National, Margaret had never called me with an urgent matter. She was my private banker, a woman I'd grown to trust implicitly over the past decade. Her voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. "What kind of matter, Margaret?" I asked, setting down my reading glasses. "Sir, we received a wire transfer request this morning for $2.3 million from your primary savings account. The transfer was authorized with what appears to be your digital signature and banking credentials. However, our security protocols flagged this transaction for several reasons." The words hit me like a physical blow. $2.3 million. That was nearly a third of my liquid assets. My mouth went dry as I processed what she was saying. "I didn't authorize any wire transfer, Margaret. Where was this money supposed to go?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "The receiving account is registered to a David M. Harrison at Wells Fargo in Los Angeles. The address on file shows a Malibu residence." "Sir, is this your son?" My heart stopped. David Michael Harrison, my only child, my 34-year-old son, who I'd been supporting financially for the better part of his adult life, the son who had moved to California 3 years ago to find himself and had been asking for increasingly larger sums of money ever since. "Yes," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "That's my son. Mr. Harrison, I need to ask you directly. Did you authorize David to make this transfer?" "Absolutely not." The words came out sharper than I intended, but the reality was crashing over me like a tsunami. My son, my own flesh and blood, had tried to steal over $2 million from me. Margaret's voice became more businesslike, more careful. "Sir, we've temporarily frozen the transaction pending your confirmation. Given the large amount and the fact that this request came from a different IP address than your usual location, our fraud detection system automatically flagged it. We'll need you to come in person to verify your identity and discuss next steps." I sat there in stunned silence, staring at the family photo on my desk. David's graduation from UCLA, both of us smiling broadly, his arm around my shoulders. He looked so proud that day, so full of promise. Where had it all gone wrong? "Mr. Harrison, are you still there?" "Yes, I'm here." "Margaret, can you tell me more about how this happened? How did he get access to my account?" "That's something we'll need to investigate thoroughly. What I can tell you is that the transfer request included your online banking login credentials and what appeared to be your electronic signature. Someone with intimate knowledge of your banking information initiated this transaction." My mind raced back over the past few months. David had been visiting more frequently, always needing money for some new venture or emergency. Last month he'd stayed for a week, claiming his apartment in Malibu had flooded and he needed a place to recover. I'd let him use my home office, my computer. Had he been watching me enter my passwords? Had he somehow copied my information? "I need to ask you something difficult, Mr. Harrison," Margaret continued. "Has anyone else had access to your banking information recently? Anyone who might have observed you conducting online transactions?" The weight of her question settled on my chest like a stone. "My son has been staying here occasionally, but Margaret, I can't believe he would... I mean, this is my child we're talking about. I understand this is incredibly difficult, sir. Family financial fraud is unfortunately more common than people realize. The emotional impact can be devastating, but right now, we need to focus on protecting your assets and determining exactly what happened." I walked to the window, looking out at the manicured lawn where David used to play as a child. 25 years ago, he was throwing a football in that same yard, dreaming of making the high school team. I was so proud of him then, so certain he would make something of himself. "What happens now?" I asked. "First, we'll keep the freeze in place. Second, I recommend you change all your online banking passwords immediately. Third, we'll need you to come in tomorrow morning so we can review the security footage from when the transfer was initiated and go through your account activity in detail. Depending on what we find, we may need to involve law enforcement. Law enforcement? My son could go to jail for this. There's something else, Mr. Harrison. This isn't the first irregularity we've noticed on your account recently." My stomach dropped further. "What do you mean?" Over the past 6 months, we've seen several smaller transactions that seemed unusual, nothing large enough to trigger our fraud alerts. But in light of today's incident, we need to review them all. Amounts ranging from $15,000 to $50,000, all transferred to various accounts that we now suspect may be connected to your son. I sank into my leather chair, the same chair where I'd built my consulting business over 3 decades, where I'd made the financial decisions that had provided David with every advantage in life. Private schools, summer camps, a car for his 16th birthday, full tuition at UCLA, and countless bailouts ever since. How much are we talking about, Margaret? Preliminary numbers suggest approximately $300,000 over the past 6 months, but we'll need to go back further to get the complete picture. $300,000 on top of the legitimate money I'd been sending him monthly. I thought about all the stories David had told me, the failed business ventures, the medical emergencies, the temporary setbacks that always seemed to require exactly the amount I had available. Mr. Harrison, I want you to know that we take this very seriously. Your relationship with First National spans decades, and we're committed to protecting you and recovering any funds that were improperly transferred. After I hung up with Margaret, I sat in my office for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The house felt different somehow, violated. Every corner seemed to hold the memory of David's recent visits, every surface potentially compromised by his betrayal. I thought about calling him immediately, confronting him, demanding an explanation, but something held me back. Maybe it was the shock, or maybe it was the small voice in the back of my mind that had been growing louder over the past year, the voice that had been questioning David's increasingly elaborate stories and desperate requests for money. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from David. "Hey Dad, hope you're having a great day, love you." The casual tone, the cheerful emoji he'd included, it felt like salt in an open wound. As I stared at the message, I realized this wasn't just about money. This was about trust, about family, about the fundamental relationship between a father and son that I thought was unbreakable. I set the phone down without responding and walked to the kitchen to make coffee, my hands shaking slightly as I measured the grounds. Tomorrow I would go to the bank and learn the full extent of what my son had done to me. Tonight, I would have to figure out how a father processes the fact that his own child had tried to steal his life savings. The coffee maker gurgled to life, and I stood there in my kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of the life I'd built, wondering if anything I thought I knew about my family was actually true. The night stretched endlessly. Robert Harrison lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation he'd had with David over the past year. Sleep felt impossible when every memory was now tainted with suspicion. At 4:30 a.m., he gave up pretending and made his way to the kitchen. The morning ritual of coffee felt different somehow, as if even the familiar motions of his daily routine had been contaminated by yesterday's revelations. He found himself checking his phone obsessively, half expecting another cheerful text from David, another casual "love you, Dad," that would now feel like a knife twist. By 8 a.m., Robert was dressed in his best suit, the navy blue Armani that Sarah had picked out for him years ago, and heading toward Manhattan. The drive into the city gave him time to think, to prepare himself for whatever Margaret might show him at the bank. First National's private banking offices occupied the entire 42nd floor of a gleaming tower in Midtown. Robert had been here dozens of times over the years, but today the marble lobby and tasteful artwork felt cold and unwelcoming. Margaret met him at the elevator, her usually warm smile replaced by professional concern. "Mr. Harrison, thank you for coming in so quickly. I've prepared everything we need to review in Conference Room B." Margaret was a woman in her 50s, impeccably dressed, with the kind of quiet competence that made wealthy clients feel secure about their financial decisions. Robert had always appreciated her direct communication style, but today he dreaded what she might have to tell him. The conference room was windowless but elegant, with a long mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs. Spread across the table were printed bank statements, computer printouts, and what appeared to be surveillance photographs. "Before we begin," Margaret said, settling into her chair, "I want you to know that what we're about to discuss is going to be difficult. We've spent the night conducting a thorough investigation, and the picture that's emerged is troubling." Robert took a deep breath. "I need to know everything, Margaret, no matter how bad it is." Margaret opened the first folder. "Let's start with yesterday's attempted transfer. We were able to trace the IP address of the computer used to initiate the transaction. It originated from a public library in Malibu, California, at 11:47 a.m. Pacific time. The person would have needed not only your online banking credentials, but also access to your email account to retrieve the security verification code. She slid a surveillance photo across the table. The image was grainy but clear enough to make Robert's heart sink. It showed David sitting at a computer terminal in what was obviously a library, his face clearly visible as he looked at the screen. Your son spent approximately 45 minutes at this terminal. According to the library's computer logs, he accessed multiple financial websites during that session, including your accounts at First National, Vanguard, and Charles Schwab. Robert stared at the photo, trying to reconcile the image of his son's focused concentration with the crime he was apparently committing. David looked calm, methodical, not like someone acting out of desperation, but like someone executing a carefully planned operation. How long has this been going on, Margaret? She opened a second folder, this one much thicker. Our investigation suggests approximately 18 months, but the pattern has accelerated significantly in recent months. Let me walk you through what we found. The next hour was a masterclass in financial deception. Margaret showed him forged documents, traced email accounts, and a web of small transactions that painted a picture of systematic theft. David hadn't just been stealing large amounts, he'd been skimming smaller sums regularly, amounts small enough to avoid triggering automatic fraud detection. Here's what's particularly sophisticated about your son's approach, Margaret explained, pointing to a spreadsheet. He never took the same amount twice, never used predictable timing, and he varied the receiving accounts. We've identified at least 7 different bank accounts that he's used to receive transferred funds. Robert examined the list of accounts. Some were in David's name. Others belonged to people he'd never heard of. Who are these other people? We're still investigating, but we believe they may be accomplices or possibly other victims. Identity theft is often a component of this type of fraud. The scope of it was staggering. What Robert had initially thought was a single moment of weakness was actually an elaborate criminal enterprise. David hadn't just betrayed his father's trust. He'd apparently been running a sophisticated financial fraud operation. The total amount we've identified so far is $847,000 over the past 18 months, Margaret said quietly. But Mr. Harrison, we think there may be more. Robert felt physically ill. Nearly $1 million. Money that could have lasted him years in retirement. Money he'd planned to leave to David as his inheritance. His son had been systematically stealing his own legacy. There's something else, Margaret continued, opening a third folder. We found evidence that your son has been using your personal information to apply for credit cards and loans in your name. None of these applications were successful. Your credit is excellent, and the amounts he was requesting triggered additional verification processes, but the attempts were made. She showed him copies of credit applications for cards he'd never requested, loan applications for amounts he'd never needed. Each one bore his forged signature and personal information that only someone with intimate access to his life could have provided. He's been living in my house periodically, Robert said, the reality settling over him like a heavy blanket. He had access to all my documents, my mail, my computer. He's seen me conduct online banking transactions. That explains how he obtained your login credentials and personal information. But Mr. Harrison, the level of planning and execution we're seeing here suggests this wasn't opportunistic. This appears to have been a deliberate long-term strategy. Robert thought about all the visits over the past year and a half, David's sudden interest in spending time with his father, his willingness to help with household tasks, his offers to handle bill payments or manage correspondence while Robert traveled. Every act of apparent filial devotion now seemed like reconnaissance for his criminal activities. What about the stories he told me? The medical emergencies, the business opportunities, the car accident, were any of those real? Margaret consulted her notes. We've been able to verify some elements, but most appear to have been greatly exaggerated or entirely fabricated. For example, the emergency medical procedure in January. We found evidence of a minor outpatient procedure that would have cost less than $2,000, not the $25,000 you sent. Each revelation felt like another betrayal. Not only had David stolen from him, but he'd manipulated Robert's love and concern, weaponizing his father's natural desire to help and protect his child. The business opportunities were particularly elaborate, Margaret continued. Your son created fake websites, produced fraudulent investment documents, and even arranged for associates to pose as business partners during phone calls. This wasn't amateur hour, Mr. Harrison. This was a professional-level con operation. Robert remembered those phone calls, the earnest young entrepreneurs who had spoken so passionately about their startups. their gratitude for Robert's willingness to invest through David's recommendation. Had they all been actors? Had David been laughing at his father's gullibility while orchestrating these elaborate performances? "I need to ask you something difficult," Robert said. "In your professional opinion, is there any chance this was about desperation, drug addiction, gambling debts, something that might explain this level of calculation?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "Mr. Harrison, we see a lot of financial fraud cases. When they involve family members, they usually fall into predictable patterns. Addiction-driven theft tends to be more erratic, more obviously desperate. What we're seeing here is methodical, patient, and increasingly sophisticated over time. This looks like someone who discovered they had a talent for financial manipulation and decided to develop it into a lifestyle." The words hit Robert like a physical blow. A lifestyle. His son hadn't made a series of terrible decisions driven by circumstances beyond his control. He'd chosen to become a professional criminal, and he'd chosen his own father as his primary victim. "What happens now?" Robert asked. "That depends partly on what you want to happen. We have clear evidence of multiple felonies: wire fraud, identity theft, forgery, and conspiracy. The FBI will definitely be interested in this case, especially given the interstate nature of the crimes and the sophisticated methods involved." Robert stared at the evidence spread across the table. Bank records, surveillance photos, forged documents, the complete dismantling of everything he'd believed about his relationship with his son. "But," Margaret continued gently, "I understand this isn't just a financial crime for you. This is your child. You'll need time to process not just the legal implications, but the personal ones." For the first time since entering the conference room, Robert felt the full emotional weight of what was happening crash over him. His son, the boy he'd taught to ride a bike, the teenager he'd helped with college applications, the young man he'd been so proud to call his child, was a criminal. Not just any criminal, but one who had specifically targeted him, studied him, manipulated him with surgical precision. If anyone watching this has ever had to face the reality that someone you raised turned out to be completely different from who you thought they were, let me know where you're watching from. The isolation of this kind of betrayal is almost unbearable. Margaret reached across the table and handed him a box of tissues. "Mr. Harrison, I want you to know that none of this is your fault. Sophisticated fraudsters often target family members because the emotional manipulation is so effective. Your son exploited your love for him. That's on him, not on you." But Robert wasn't sure he believed that. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice was asking whether he'd failed as a father, whether he'd been too permissive, too generous, too blind to warning signs that might have been obvious to others. As they wrapped up the meeting, Margaret handed him a thick folder containing copies of everything they'd discussed. "Take your time reviewing this. When you're ready, we'll need to discuss next steps, both for recovering the stolen funds and for deciding whether to pursue criminal charges." Robert walked out of the bank, carrying evidence of his son's betrayal, feeling like he was carrying the weight of his entire failed relationship with David. The sunny March afternoon felt surreal after the darkness of the conference room revelations. His phone buzzed with a text message from David. "Hope you're having a great day, Dad. Can't wait to tell you more about that investment opportunity. Call me when you have a chance." The casual tone, the exclamation points, the heart emoji, it all felt like mockery now. Robert realized that while he'd been sitting in that conference room, learning the full extent of his son's crimes, David had been sending him cheerful messages, probably already planning his next move. For the first time since this nightmare began, Robert felt something other than hurt and confusion. He felt anger. Robert sat in his car outside the bank for 20 minutes, staring at his phone. David's cheerful message glowed on the screen, each word now dripping with implied deception. The investment opportunity, the fake urgency, the manipulative affection. His finger hovered over David's contact information. For 34 years, calling his son had been one of life's simple pleasures. Now it felt like entering a battlefield, where he didn't know the rules and his opponent had been preparing for years. Finally, he pressed the call button. "Dad." Perfect timing. David's voice was bright, energetic, carrying that familiar warmth that had always made Robert's heart swell with paternal pride. Now it made his stomach turn. "I was just thinking about you. How was your day?" "It was interesting," Robert said carefully, pulling out of the bank's parking garage and heading toward the highway. "I had a meeting with my banker." "Oh yeah? Everything okay with the accounts? I know you worry about that stuff sometimes." The casual tone, the feigned concern, it was masterful. It was, If Robert hadn't spent the morning reviewing surveillance footage of David committing felonies, he might have been touched by his son's apparent interest in his financial well-being. "Actually, David, that's what I wanted to talk to you about. There was an unusual transaction attempt yesterday. Someone tried to transfer a large amount of money from my account." There was a pause, just a heartbeat, but Robert caught it. When David spoke again, his voice carried a note of concern that sounded almost genuine. "That's terrible, Dad. How much are we talking about? Do they know who did it?" The performance was flawless. The right amount of shock, the appropriate level of protective anger on his father's behalf. If Robert didn't know better, he'd be reaching for his wallet to send David plane fare to come home and help deal with this crisis. $2.3 million, Robert said, watching the traffic around him while listening intently to his son's response. "Jesus Christ, Dad, that's almost everything, isn't it? Please tell me the bank caught it in time." They did. The transaction was blocked. Robert paused, giving David a chance to reveal himself. The money was being sent to an account in Los Angeles, in Malibu specifically. Another pause, slightly longer this time. "Malibu? That's not far from where I live. Dad, you don't think... I mean, this is probably just a coincidence, right? There are thousands of bank accounts in the LA area." Robert had to admire the strategy. Rather than immediately deflecting suspicion away from himself, David was acknowledging the geographic connection while positioning himself as equally concerned about the implications. It was exactly what an innocent person might say. The account belonged to someone named David M. Harrison. The silence that followed was different. Robert could almost hear his son's mind working, calculating, trying to figure out how much his father knew and what the best response might be. "Dad," David said finally, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "I think we need to talk about this in person. This sounds like someone might be using my identity as part of some kind of scam. We should probably contact the police." It was brilliant, really. David was positioning himself as a fellow victim, someone whose identity had been stolen as part of the crime against his father. If Robert hadn't seen the surveillance footage, hadn't spent the morning reviewing 18 months of systematic theft, he might have fallen for it completely. "Where are you right now, David?" "I'm at home." "Why?" "I'm going to send you something, and I want you to look at it while we're talking." Robert pulled over at a rest stop and used his phone to take a photo of the surveillance image Margaret had shown him. His hands shook slightly as he sent it to David. "Check your messages," Robert said. The silence stretched on so long that Robert wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, David spoke, and for the first time in the conversation, his voice sounded different. Smaller, less confident. "Dad, I can explain this." Those 4 words hit Robert like a sledgehammer. After days of wondering, hours of hoping there might be some innocent explanation, his son had just confirmed everything. The bank was right, Margaret was right. His worst fears were true. "I'm listening," Robert said, though he wasn't sure he actually wanted to hear whatever David might say. "It's not what it looks like. I mean, yes, that's me in the picture, but I wasn't trying to steal from you. I was trying to help you." Robert almost laughed at the audacity of it. "Help me? By stealing $2 million? Dad, you have to understand. I've been watching your investments, and you're being too conservative. You're missing out on opportunities that could double or triple your money. I was going to invest that money in a cryptocurrency venture that I knew would pay off, and then transfer back double what I took, plus interest." The lie was so elaborate, so detailed, that Robert found himself momentarily impressed by his son's creativity. David had managed to transform attempted grand theft into a misguided but well-intentioned investment strategy. "And you decided to do this without telling me because I knew you'd say no, Dad. You've always been risk-averse. It served you well, but it's also cost you opportunities. I've been making money in crypto for months now. I wanted to surprise you with a huge return on investment." Robert pulled out the folder Margaret had given him and flipped to the page showing David's multiple bank accounts and the timeline of thefts going back 18 months. "David, what about the other money? The $847,000 that you've taken over the past year and a half." This time the silence was absolute. Robert could hear traffic in the background on David's end of the call, could hear his son breathing, but no words came. "The medical emergency that cost $25,000 for a $2,000 procedure. The business investments that went to fake companies. The car accident that never happened." "Dad," David's voice was barely a whisper now. "I've seen the evidence, David, all of it. The fake websites you created, the actors you hired to pose as business partners, the forged documents. This wasn't about helping me or investing my money. This was about stealing from me systematically for over a year. Robert heard what might have been a sob on the other end of the line, but he couldn't tell if it was genuine remorse or just another manipulation tactic. "I never meant for it to go this far," David said finally. "It started small. I was in real trouble, and I just needed a little help to get back on my feet. But then it got easier, and I told myself I'd pay it all back once I got established out here." "What kind of trouble?" Robert asked, though he wasn't sure he believed anything David might tell him at this point. "Gambling debts. I got involved with some bad people, Dad. I owed money to people who don't accept payment plans. I was desperate." Robert considered this. It was possible. Gambling addiction would explain the escalating need for money, the elaborate lies, the willingness to betray family trust. But it didn't explain the sophisticated fraud operation, the fake business websites, the long-term strategic thinking that had gone into deceiving him. "How much do you owe them, David?" "It was about $200,000 initially, but with interest and penalties," David's voice trailed off. "So you've stolen over $800,000 to pay a $200,000 debt. The rest? I don't know, Dad. I guess I got used to having money available. I started living like I was actually successful, instead of just pretending to be. I bought a nice car, moved into an expensive apartment, started dating women who expected a certain lifestyle. There it was, the truth finally. David hadn't been desperately stealing to survive or pay off dangerous creditors. He'd been stealing to fund a fantasy life, to pretend to be the successful man he'd never actually become. "What happens now?" Robert asked. "Are you going to turn me in?" The question hung in the air between them. Robert thought about the FBI investigation Margaret had mentioned, about the federal crimes David had committed, about the years in prison his son might face if this went to court. But he also thought about Sarah, about the promises he'd made at her deathbed to always take care of their son, about the little boy who used to climb into his lap and ask him to read bedtime stories. "I don't know yet," Robert said honestly. "I need time to think. Dad, please, I know I screwed up, but I'm still your son. I'm still the kid you raised. People make mistakes." "This wasn't a mistake, David. This was a choice, hundreds of choices, made over 18 months to lie to me and steal from me and manipulate my love for you." Robert heard David crying now, or at least making the sounds of crying. After everything he'd learned about his son's capacity for deception, he couldn't even trust that the emotion was real. If there's anyone out there who's ever had to decide whether to protect someone you love from the consequences of their actions, even when those actions hurt you deeply, I'd love to know where you're watching from. This might be the hardest decision I've ever had to make. "What do you want me to do?" David asked. "I want you to come home," Robert said, surprising himself with the words. "I want you to look me in the eye and tell me everything. No more lies, no more manipulation, no more performances. I want the truth about all of it. And then we'll figure out what comes next." After the call ended, Robert sat in his car at the rest stop, watching families travel together, couples holding hands, children playing in the grass nearby, normal people living normal lives, unburdened by the knowledge that their most important relationships were built on lies. He thought about the boy David had been, the man Robert had hoped he would become, and the criminal he had apparently chosen to be instead. Somewhere in the wreckage of his faith in his son, Robert had to find a way to move forward. The drive home felt endless, each mile bringing him closer to a confrontation he wasn't sure he was prepared for. But one thing was certain: the father who had walked into that bank this morning would not be the same man who emerged from whatever came next. David arrived 3 days later on a red-eye flight from Los Angeles. Robert waited in the terminal, watching passengers emerge from the gate, searching for the face he'd known since birth but somehow felt like he'd never really seen clearly until now. When David appeared, Robert was struck by how different his son looked. Gone was the confident, successful entrepreneur persona David had been projecting during his recent visits. This version of David looked tired, defeated, smaller somehow. He wore a simple t-shirt and jeans instead of the expensive designer clothes he'd been favoring lately. His hair was unkempt, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. "Dad," David said quietly as he approached, carrying only a single duffel bag. Robert nodded but didn't move to embrace his son. The automatic gesture of paternal affection felt impossible now, replaced by a careful distance that hurt more than he'd expected. The drive home was silent, except for the hum of traffic and the occasional clearing of throats. Robert found himself stealing glances at David in the passenger seat, studying his profile as if he might discover some clue he'd missed over the years, some sign that would explain how they'd arrived at this moment. David stared out the window at the familiar landscape of Westchester County, the neighborhoods where he'd grown up, the schools he'd attended, the parks where Robert had taught him to throw a baseball. Neither of them spoke until they pulled into the driveway of the house that had been David's home for the first 18 years of his life. "It looks exactly the same," David said, his voice carrying a note of wonder that seemed genuine. "I haven't changed much since you moved out," Robert replied, though the words carried an unintended weight. He'd kept the house as a shrine to his family, preserving David's room, maintaining the gardens Sarah had loved, holding onto a version of his life that apparently had never really existed. Inside, they sat in the living room, where they'd had countless conversations over the years, family discussions about school, about college choices, about David's future plans. Now they faced each other across the same coffee table where David had once spread homework and college brochures, but the dynamic was completely different. "I don't know where to start," David said, his hands clasped in his lap like a child waiting to be scolded. "Start with the truth," Robert said. "All of it. When did this really begin? How did you get access to my accounts? What did you do with the money?" David took a deep breath, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Robert saw something in his son's face that looked like genuine remorse. "It started about 3 years ago, right after Mom's anniversary," David said, referring to the date Sarah had died. "I was having a really hard time that year. I'd lost my job, my girlfriend had left me, and I was drinking too much. So I called you crying one night, remember?" Robert did remember. David had been inconsolable, talking about feeling like a failure, about disappointing his mother's memory. Robert had immediately offered to help financially, the same way he always had. "You sent me $15,000 to get back on my feet, but instead of using it to find an apartment or look for work, I went to Vegas. I thought I could multiply it, win enough to actually become the success you thought I was. You lost it all? Worse. I lost that, plus ran up another $30,000 in debt to the casino. That's when I started getting desperate. I asked you for money to move to California for a job opportunity, and you sent it without question." Robert remembered that conversation too. David had seemed so excited about his fresh start, so optimistic about his prospects. It had never occurred to Robert to ask for details about the job or to verify any part of David's story. "The pattern started there," David continued. "I realized how easy it was to get money from you if I had the right story. You wanted to believe I was succeeding, so you'd accept any explanation that fit that narrative. The honesty was brutal, but Robert found himself grateful for it after so many lies. "When did you start accessing my accounts directly?" "That came later. At first I was just asking for money and you were sending it, but the amounts I needed kept getting bigger, and I was afraid you'd start asking questions if I kept requesting $50,000 transfers." David explained how he'd begun paying attention during his visits home, watching Robert handle online banking, memorizing passwords and security questions. He'd used Robert's computer to access his email, finding bank communications and learning the patterns of Robert's financial life. "The first unauthorized transfer was only $5,000, David said. "Small enough that I figured you might not notice, and if you did, I could claim it was a banking error. When that worked, I got bolder. What about the elaborate schemes, the fake businesses, the actors?" David's face reddened with what appeared to be shame. That was actually kind of genius, if I'm being honest. I met this guy in Los Angeles, Marcus, who runs these confidence scams. He taught me how to create legitimate-looking websites, how to write convincing business proposals, how to find people willing to play roles for money." Robert felt sick. His son hadn't just stolen from him, he'd apprenticed himself to professional criminals. Marcus said family marks were the easiest because they want to believe you're successful. He called it affection exploitation. The deeper the relationship, the easier the con. The clinical terminology made it worse somehow. Robert's love for his son had been reduced to a tactical advantage in a criminal operation. "How much of what you've told me over the past 2 years was true?" David was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with how much honesty he was prepared to offer. "Almost none of it, Dad. The apartment in Malibu, I rent a room in a house with 4 other guys. The consulting business, I've been working part-time at a coffee shop. The girlfriend who's a lawyer, she doesn't exist." Each revelation felt like a small death. The life Robert had imagined for his son, the pride he'd felt in David's apparent success, the future he'd envisioned for them both, all of it had been an elaborate fiction. "What about the gambling debts you mentioned on the phone?" "Those were real initially, but I paid them off months ago. The rest of the money..." David looked around the living room, at the family photos that lined the mantelpiece, at the life his father had built. "I spent it trying to become the person I'd been pretending to be. Expensive clothes, nice restaurants, trips. trying to impress people who didn't actually care about me. Robert thought about all the times David had posted photos on social media from exotic locations, fancy restaurants, exclusive events. He'd been so proud of his son's apparent success, had shown those photos to friends and colleagues as evidence of David's thriving life in California. "Did you ever think about what this would do to me?" Robert asked. "Not just financially, but emotionally?" David's composure finally cracked. Tears began streaming down his face, and his voice broke as he spoke. "I told myself you'd never find out. I convinced myself I'd eventually pay it all back somehow. And honestly, Dad, there were times when I almost forgot it was stealing because you'd always been so generous with money anyway." The twisted logic was staggering. David had rationalized his crimes by referencing his father's generosity, as if Robert's willingness to help his son financially somehow justified David's theft. "But you knew it was wrong," Robert said. "You knew I didn't consent to those transfers." "Of course I knew, but I also knew that if I asked for that much money outright, you'd say no, or start asking questions I couldn't answer. So I took it instead and planned to deal with the consequences later. The consequences are here now, David." They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of the conversation settling between them. Robert looked at his son, really looked at him, and tried to reconcile the child he'd raised with the criminal sitting across from him. "I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer," Robert said finally. "If the bank hadn't caught that transfer, if you'd successfully stolen the $2 million, what would you have done next?" David was quiet for so long that Robert wondered if he was going to answer at all. "I would have disappeared," David said eventually. "Changed my name, moved somewhere you couldn't find me. I was planning to take as much as I could and start over completely." The admission hung in the air like a physical presence. David hadn't just been stealing money, he'd been planning to steal himself away from Robert entirely, leaving his father not only financially devastated, but completely alone. "So when you called me after the bank blocked the transfer, when you acted concerned and surprised, that was all performance?" "Yes, I was buying time, trying to figure out how much you knew and whether I could still salvage the situation." For anyone who's ever wondered if the person you're talking to is telling you the truth or just telling you what they think you want to hear, drop a comment about where you're watching from. Sometimes the hardest conversations are with the people we love most. Robert stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the yard where he'd pushed David on a swing set that was long gone, where they'd played catch on summer evenings, where Sarah had taught David to garden. The innocence of those memories felt almost violent now, contrasted against the reality of who David had become. "What happens now?" David asked from behind him. Robert turned around to face his son. "That depends on what you do next." "What do you mean?" "I mean that I have a choice to make. I can report this to the FBI and let them handle it as a federal crime, or I can try to find another way forward. But if I choose the second option, you have to earn it." David leaned forward, hope flickering in his eyes for the first time since he'd arrived. "Tell me what you need me to do." Robert looked at his son, at the man who had systematically betrayed him for over a year, at the child he still loved despite everything, and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Robert walked to his desk and pulled out a legal pad, the same kind he'd used throughout his consulting career to outline complex financial strategies for his clients. Now he was about to design a different kind of plan, one that might save his son's future while protecting what remained of his own. "Here's what's going to happen," Robert said, sitting back down across from David. "You're going to move back into this house. You're going to get a job, any job, and you're going to start paying me back every penny you stole." David nodded eagerly, relief evident on his face. "Yes, absolutely. Whatever you want, Dad. I'll do anything." "I'm not finished." Robert's voice carried a steel that David had rarely heard before. "You're also going to submit to random drug and alcohol testing. You're going to attend Gamblers Anonymous meetings. You're going to see a therapist who specializes in addiction and criminal behavior. And you're going to do all of this while living under conditions that I set." The eagerness in David's expression began to fade as the reality of what his father was proposing sank in. "What kind of conditions?" "No access to any of my financial accounts, obviously. No credit cards, no car. You'll use public transportation or I'll drive you where you need to go. No internet access without supervision. Your phone will have monitoring software installed. You'll have a curfew and you'll account for every hour of every day." David's face had gone pale. "Dad, that sounds like prison." "It's not prison, David. Prison is where you'll go if I decide to press charges. This is me offering you a chance to earn back some small measure of trust while making restitution for what you've done." Robert had spent the sleepless hours since their phone conversation thinking about this moment. He'd considered every option, from complete forgiveness to immediate prosecution. This middle path felt like the only one that might actually lead somewhere constructive. How long would this arrangement last? Until you've paid back every dollar you stole, plus interest. At minimum wage, working full-time, that's probably 8 to 10 years, maybe longer, depending on how seriously you take the rehabilitation aspects. David was quiet for several minutes, clearly calculating whether this was better or worse than taking his chances with the federal justice system. And if I agree to this, you won't call the FBI? I won't call them immediately. But David, understand this. If you violate any aspect of this agreement, if you lie to me again, if you try to manipulate me or access my accounts or disappear, I will turn over everything I have to law enforcement. And at that point, you'll face not only the original charges, but also violation of our agreement. Robert pulled out the folder Margaret had given him and spread some of the evidence across the coffee table. Take a look at this again. Really look at it. These are federal crimes, David. Wire fraud, identity theft, conspiracy. You're looking at potentially decades in prison if this goes to trial. David stared at the documents, at the surveillance photos, at the detailed timeline of his crimes. For the first time since he'd arrived, he seemed to fully grasp the gravity of his situation. There's something else, Robert continued. Part of your restitution will involve helping the bank and potentially law enforcement understand exactly how you did what you did. They want to use your case to improve their fraud detection systems. You'll have to cooperate fully with their investigation. You want me to help them catch other people doing what I did? I want you to take responsibility for the damage you've caused, not just to me, but to the financial institutions you defrauded, and potentially to other victims of similar crimes. Robert watched his son process this information. David had always been intelligent, and Robert could see him working through the implications, weighing his options, calculating the best path forward. What about my life in California? My job? My apartment? What life, David? You just told me that almost everything about your supposed life in California was a lie. You work part-time at a coffee shop and rent a room in a shared house. You have no real relationships, no actual career prospects, and no legitimate way to pay off the criminal debts you've accumulated. The harshness of it was intentional. Robert needed David to understand that the fantasy life he'd been living was over, that the choices ahead were between taking responsibility or facing prosecution. This arrangement I'm offering you is probably the only chance you'll have to rebuild your life legitimately, Robert continued. If you go to prison, you'll have a federal criminal record that will follow you forever. If you complete this program successfully, you'll have learned actual job skills, dealt with your addiction issues, and proven that you can live responsibly. David stood up and began pacing around the living room, a habit he'd had since childhood when facing difficult decisions. Robert watched him move through the space, remembering all the times they'd had serious conversations in this room about grades, about college choices, about David's future plans. None of those conversations had prepared either of them for this moment. There's one more thing, Robert said quietly. If you choose to do this, if you commit to this path, I need you to understand that our relationship will never be the same. I will probably never trust you completely again. The easy affection we used to have, the automatic assumption that you're telling me the truth, that's gone, David. Maybe forever. David stopped pacing and turned to face his father. But there would still be a relationship? You wouldn't just write me off completely? Robert considered the question carefully. He'd been asking himself the same thing for days. Could he love a son who had betrayed him so thoroughly? Could they rebuild something genuine from the wreckage of so much deception? I will always be your father, Robert said finally. But you will have to earn the right to be my son again. The distinction hit David visibly. Robert saw him understand, perhaps for the first time, that love and trust were not the same thing, that the unconditional support he'd taken for granted was now very much conditional indeed. What if I can't do it? David asked. What if I'm not strong enough to live like that for 8 or 10 years? Then you'll have learned something important about yourself, and you'll face the consequences of your choices like an adult. Robert stood up and walked to the mantelpiece, where family photos chronicled David's childhood and adolescence, birthdays, graduations, vacations, all the milestones of a privileged life that had somehow produced a son capable of systematically robbing his own father. I've been thinking about where I went wrong, Robert said, not turning around. After your mother died, I tried to be both parents to you. I wanted to honor her memory by making sure you never wanted for anything, but I think I confused love with money, support with enabling. He turned back to face David. I made it too easy for you to take advantage of me, because I made it too easy for you to take advantage of everything. You never had to face real consequences for your mistakes, because I was always there to fix them. David was crying now, but Robert found himself unmoved by the tears. He'd seen too much calculated emotion from his son to trust any display of feeling completely. This arrangement I'm offering you, it's not just about paying me back. It's about you learning to live like a responsible adult, maybe for the first time in your life. And if I say no, Robert reached for his phone. Then I call Margaret at the bank right now, and she starts the process of turning this over to federal investigators. You'll probably be arrested within a week. David sank back into his chair, the weight of his situation finally seeming to fully register. How do I know you won't change your mind later? How do I know that even if I do everything you're asking, you won't decide to prosecute me anyway? It was a fair question, and Robert appreciated that David was thinking strategically even in his desperation. You don't know that. You'll have to trust me the same way I trusted you for the past 18 months. The difference is, I've never stolen from you. The parallel was intentional and cruel, but necessary. David needed to understand that trust was something he would have to extend without guarantee, just as Robert had done for years. I need time to think about this, David said. You have until tomorrow morning. If you're not ready to commit completely by then, I'm calling the FBI. Robert walked toward the stairs, then paused. David, I want you to understand something. I'm not offering you this deal because I think you deserve it. I'm offering it because I still hope you might be capable of becoming someone who deserves it. For those of you watching who have ever had to choose between justice and mercy for someone you love, let me know what country you're tuning in from. These kinds of decisions change you, no matter what you choose. As Robert climbed the stairs to his bedroom, he could hear David crying in the living room below. Whether those tears represented genuine remorse or just fear of consequences, Robert no longer felt qualified to judge. Tomorrow, David would make a choice that would determine the direction of both their lives. Tonight, Robert would lie awake, wondering if he was being wise or foolish, merciful or enabling, a loving father or a Mark who still hadn't learned his lesson. One thing was certain: regardless of David's decision, the man who had raised him with unconditional love and limitless financial support was gone forever. In his place was someone harder, more careful, and infinitely sadder about what family could become when trust died. Robert woke before dawn, having slept only in fragments throughout the night. Every creak of the house, every sound from downstairs had pulled him from whatever brief rest he'd managed to find. Part of him wondered if David might simply disappear during the night, choosing flight over, facing the consequences of his actions once again. But when Robert came downstairs at 6 a.m. to make coffee, he found David sitting at the kitchen table, still wearing the same clothes from the day before, staring at a piece of paper covered with handwritten notes. You didn't sleep, Robert observed. Couldn't. David looked up at his father with eyes that were red-rimmed but alert. I've been thinking about everything you said, and I've been writing down questions. Robert poured himself coffee and sat across from his son. The morning light streaming through the kitchen windows felt different somehow, as if this conversation would determine not just their immediate future, but the fundamental nature of who they would be to each other going forward. What kinds of questions? David consulted his notes, practical ones mostly. Where would I work? How would the monitoring software on my phone actually function? What happens if I get sick and can't work for a while? How would the therapy and Gamblers Anonymous meetings be scheduled around a work schedule? Robert was surprised by the specificity of the questions. They suggested that David was seriously considering accepting the deal rather than simply looking for ways to negotiate better terms. Those are all reasonable questions, Robert said. What else? I wrote down every lie I told you over the past 2 years. Every fake emergency, every fabricated business opportunity, every manipulation. David slid the paper across the table. I want you to read it. Robert looked down at the list written in David's familiar handwriting, but documenting a catalogue of deception that spanned multiple pages. The medical emergencies that never happened, the business partnerships that were fictional, the girlfriend who didn't exist, the apartment that was actually a rented room. Line after line of systematic dishonesty. Why did you write this? Because I realized last night that I've been lying to myself as much as I've been lying to you. I kept telling myself that each lie was small, that each theft was temporary, that I'd eventually make everything right. But seeing it all written down like this, David's voice trailed off. Robert scanned the list, recognizing story after story that had tugged at his heartstrings, that had opened his wallet, that had reinforced his belief that his son was struggling but fundamentally decent. The sheer volume of deception was staggering. "There's something else," David continued. "I called Marcus, the guy in LA who taught me the fraud techniques. I told him I was done, that I wouldn't be working with him anymore." "How did he react to that?" "He laughed, said I'd be back within a month because Marks always forgive family. He said you'd probably give me money to disappear and never bother you again." Robert felt a chill at the casual way this criminal had discussed his family situation. "Is that what you think will happen?" 3 days ago, yes. I thought I could manipulate you into giving me enough money to start over somewhere else. I thought your love for me was a weakness I could exploit indefinitely." The honesty was brutal, but Robert found himself grateful for it. After so many lies, even painful truth felt like progress. What changed? David was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with how to articulate something he wasn't sure he fully understood himself. "When you told me you'd probably never trust me completely again, it hit me that I might lose you forever. Not just your money, not just your support, but actually lose you as a person in my life. And I realized that somewhere along the way, I'd started thinking of you as an ATM instead of as my father." Robert studied his son's face, looking for signs of manipulation, for the calculated expressions he'd learned to associate with David's lies. But this felt different somehow, raw and unpolished in a way that David's usual performances never were. "I've never had to live like a responsible adult," David continued. "Even when I moved to California, I was still depending on money from you to survive. I've never had to face real consequences for my mistakes because you always fixed them. I think that's part of what made it so easy to keep lying to you." Robert thought about the years of bailouts, the countless times he'd solved David's problems with a check, the way he'd consistently chosen to help rather than to teach. His intentions had been loving, but the results had been disastrous. "So what's your decision?" David took a deep breath. "I want to accept your deal, all of it. The job, the restrictions, the monitoring, the therapy, the repayment schedule, everything." Relief flooded through Robert, followed immediately by apprehension. "Why?" "Because the alternative is spending the next 10 years in federal prison and then getting out with a criminal record that will follow me for the rest of my life. But more than that," David paused, clearly struggling with what he wanted to say. "More than that, I want to find out if I can actually be the person you thought you were raising. I want to see if there's anything salvageable in who I am underneath all the lies and manipulation." Robert felt tears welling up in his eyes for the first time since this nightmare had begun. Not tears of grief or anger, but something more complex, hope mixed with sorrow, love tempered by hard-won wisdom. "It's going to be incredibly difficult," Robert warned. "There will be days when you'll hate me for the restrictions I'm imposing. There will be times when you'll be tempted to just run away rather than face the work required to rebuild your life. I know. But Dad, I've spent 3 years running away from responsibility, and all it got me was a fake life funded by stolen money. I want to try building something real for once." Robert reached across the table and took the list of lies David had written. "Can I keep this? I want you to. I never want to forget how far down I went, and I want you to have a record of exactly what I did to you." Over the next 2 hours, they worked through the practical details of David's rehabilitation plan. Robert called his attorney to draw up a formal agreement that would protect both of them legally. He contacted Margaret at the bank to inform her of their decision and to arrange for David's cooperation with their fraud investigation. He researched therapists who specialized in criminal behavior and addiction. David would start work the following Monday at a local warehouse, physical labor that paid minimum wage but offered the possibility of advancement based on merit. He would attend Gamblers Anonymous meetings twice a week and see a therapist once a week. His phone would be monitored, his internet access restricted, his movements tracked. Most importantly, every paycheck would be split between basic living expenses and restitution payments to Robert. At the rate they calculated, it would take approximately 9 years to repay the full amount David had stolen, assuming no setbacks or additional expenses. "There's one more thing I need to tell you," Robert said as they finalized the details. "I've decided to change my will." David looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "Whatever money you don't pay back during your lifetime will be deducted from any inheritance you might receive. If you die before making full restitution, the remainder will go to charity." The news hit David visibly, but he nodded slowly. "That's fair. I stole my own inheritance, essentially." "Yes, you did. But if you complete this program successfully, If you prove that you can live responsibly and honestly, there might still be something left for you to inherit. Consider it incentive to follow through. As the afternoon wore on, Robert found himself observing his son with new eyes. The David who had arrived yesterday, defeated, desperate, still looking for angles to exploit, seemed to be giving way to someone Robert hadn't seen in years. Someone who asked practical questions instead of spinning elaborate stories. Someone who acknowledged his mistakes without immediately trying to minimize them. "I have one request," David said, as they wrapped up their planning session. "What's that?" "I want to visit Mom's grave before I start work on Monday. I want to tell her what I did and what I'm going to do to fix it." Robert felt his throat tighten. David hadn't visited Sarah's grave since the funeral, claiming it was too painful. Robert had gone alone every month for 7 years, keeping her updated on David's supposed successes, sharing his pride in their son's apparent achievements. "I'd like to go with you," Robert said. "I'd like that too, At." If you've ever watched someone you love try to find their way back from a dark place, please share where you're watching from. Recovery is such a fragile thing, and it helps to know that others understand the mixture of hope and fear that comes with giving someone a second chance. That evening, as they prepared dinner together for the first time in years, Robert reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The phone call from Margaret felt like it had happened months ago instead of just 4 days. The man who had answered that call, trusting, naive, endlessly forgiving, was gone forever. In his place was someone harder, but perhaps wiser. Someone who understood that love without boundaries was not really love at all, but enabling. Someone who had learned that the most compassionate thing he could do for his son was to stop rescuing him from the consequences of his choices. David would probably succeed at this rehabilitation program, Robert thought. His son was intelligent, capable, and now apparently motivated by genuine consequences rather than empty threats. But even if David failed, even if he ultimately chose to walk away from this difficult path, Robert would know that he had offered his son something more valuable than money, the chance to earn back his integrity. The years ahead would be challenging for both of them. There would be setbacks, moments of doubt, times when the easy affection they'd once shared would feel impossibly distant. But for the first time since Margaret's phone call had shattered his world, Robert felt something approaching peace. His son was finally home. Not the prodigal son returning to unconditional forgiveness, but a young man ready to begin the hard work of becoming someone worthy of trust. And Robert was ready to be the father David needed, rather than the father he had been. One who would support David's growth without enabling his weakness, who would offer love without abandoning accountability. It would have to be enough. For both of them, it would have to be enough.